Hello, everyone, and welcome to Agulhas Current Affairs, a marine science podcast set in South Africa with me as one of your hosts, Dr. Yanis Kiston of Geekoscopy Media, alongside
Dr. Nelson Miranda of Argonaut Science. And today we're gonna talk about the DNA. So today we're talking about DNA, and hopefully we'll be relating it to marine science as well. But DNA is a very broad thing that it's worth talking a little bit about, isn't it?
100%. Yeah, like it's the fundamental unit of life. It's what codes for every type of life that you get out there, including things that are kind of like on the cusp of living, and I'm generally referring to viruses. But everything from a virus all the way up to the most complex type of organism, whatever you deem that to be, has DNA in it, and that codes for certain things that creates what they are as an organism.
Yeah, I mean, you have the basic building blocks of life, but then you need to put them together somehow. And you need the plan, and that plan needs to be somewhere, written somewhere. Let's just say. And
it needs to be a recipe.
That's what DNA is about. DNA is the plan
to make yourself, because one of the things about life is that it needs to replicate, so that because things can die, so you want to be able to replicate yourself. So there must be a recipe that tells whatever system that, okay, here's what I look like. I want you to make another version of me, so that when I die, there's something that I can leave behind. And it might not be the same, but it's got to be similar enough so that there's more of me around to go forward. And just to point out, DNA, it stands for deoxyribonucleic acid. Probably don't need to know that. You probably remember it because you'd learn it in school or undergrad. But deoxyribonucleic acid is just a term for the things that make up the structure of DNA and the helix and the coding pairs that are there that will go on to create stuff. So
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of this jargon where the coding pairs and the helix, but we're really always talking about simple things. And I mean, this strange word deoxyribonucleic acid, it sounds like a complicated word, but if you break it up, it's very descriptive, because let's be honest, scientists are not very inventive sometimes when it comes to names. They try to keep it simple and they try to describe exactly what this is. And it's basically chemistry that we're talking about. We're talking about molecules. We're talking about atoms as the building blocks, and molecules. By the way, do you know why what the word atom, where it comes from?
Yeah, well, I know. Tom. A means anti or not, and the tom part is cut. So atom means not to cut, so indivisible. Which is
indivisible. So the smallest thing that
which is
that we can
which
cut.
we know now
that
is
says
incorrect.
A lot.
But
exactly. But it also speaks to how it's up to us, isn't it? We even define what is life and what isn't, what is alive and what is not alive. We make these decisions, and it's like we're cutting. Okay, there's the line we cut, and then whatever's on one side is not alive on whatever's on this side. But it's us as human beings. We tend to make sense of the world, and and it's so interesting to keep that in mind as well.
Yeah, for sure. It's just for simplicity. We put that line there so that we can use it to describe, or that we can do research, or that if you say something, somebody else knows what you're talking about. Because most of the time, life just exists on a spectrum. And you just putting your cut on that spectrum to describe something. But
and sometimes you cut it to be practical, to get a job done.
Exactly.
And it's good to keep that in mind. And sometimes we cut it and we try to define things to communicate, not to confuse, but to actually aid in communication. Which is funny, because the more you try to do that, the more you cut, and then it gets complicated and people don't understand what you're on about.
Then we get a bunch of jargon here, for sure.
Yeah. But we just need to step back now and again and just say, what does that mean exactly? But DNA is a very well-known term. I mean, a lot of people, if you say DNA, it's become like a thing that people recognize.
Mm. Yeah, and I mean, like in pop culture, like as soon as DNA was discovered and was like being able to use like for crime, I think it was quite of an explosion of new information for people, especially crime dramas, because there's a lot of that all the time. It's very popular,
Mm,
and DNA is a very important thing for forensic investigation. It kind of proves that a person was in a certain place, and because like that person's DNA was there, that code is only for them. So we can definitively
yeah.
say that they were there because it's their code that's there, no one else's code. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's good to remember that as living organisms, especially big ones like us, we are pretty big living organisms. As we go and we move through the environment, we actually leave behind traces of ourselves, like
Mm,
skin cells that fall off, hair,
mm,
all sorts of things that stay behind. And in that those fragments that fall out of us all the time, uh, you can extract the DNA, and that's that signal. And we spoke about this as well in another podcast and episode. We were talking about the code of
mm,
life,
mm.
and then we thought, yes, let's also talk about DNA because it seems complicated, but if you break it down, it's actually pretty simple. It's like it's a signature.
For sure.
So and that signature is basically for DNA. It's composed of four sort of what do you call them? Well, it's four molecules, isn't it? It's four molecules,
It's
and we call them.
nucleotides and they occur in base
Yeah,
pairs. Yeah.
that's right. And they have to pair with each other. So and they pair um, A to T and C to G.
Yeah.
And I always remember that because it's the curvy ones, the
The
curvy
curvy ones go
letters.
together.
They go
Yeah.
together. Yeah. Um, so they usually, and that's interesting. That's why you have a double, pairing, and it kind of locks the
Yeah.
information in
Yeah.
place, isn't
Yeah.
it?
Yeah. For sure.
Um,
That's
and you can
why.
imagine a row
Yeah.
of all of these, and that's where the code is. You get A G T C A T C G, and if I carry on for 620 something times, I can probably spell out a gene, right?
Yeah.
Which is a code for a gene.
Yeah. For sure. And that gene translates into probably a protein that your body will then produce. So it's like a signal that you tell your body to. I want the DNA like is like I want to make this thing because I need it, and then DNA gets
Mm.
replicated, transcribed into mRNA or messenger RNA, and that's a messenger that the DNA sends to the ribosomes. Pretty sure the ribosomes.
Yeah, the
The
factories, the
factory.
factories in the
Yeah,
cell.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, because we have to kind of talk about what scale we're at. This is a
Yeah.
very small
This
scale,
is in
and
the
then we're talking
in the
about the
one
scale of the
cell. Yeah,
cell
yeah,
and the
for sure.
scale of the nucleus of the cell.
Yeah.
And the cell is producing, more of itself, perhaps, or it's producing like certain proteins that are important for its function. And you could even like basically say, okay, say you need a taste bud because taste buds are important and food is important,
Yeah, yeah.
and we all like food. And then for that, there's a lot of stuff that a lot of building blocks that need to come together in certain ways to make up a taste bud. And your taste buds are made of lots of proteins, and they function due to lots and lots of proteins. And all of that information comes from the blueprint, the code, the recipe that is DNA. And then, as you say, it has to be translated and then sent somewhere for the factories, where um, these proteins can be manufactured by things called enzymes.
Yeah, for sure. And these enzymes that they code for enzymes or proteins, which are similar things, but they have their own code. That's
Yeah,
another language altogether. So you think of DNA as one type of language, let's say like English, Then the mRNA, which is the messenger RNA, which goes from the DNA to the ribosome, that is a kind of like a translator. It's like a in-between person. So the mRNA knows English and like some other language, let's say Japanese, and then the mRNA is like, oh, I got the code from the DNA. I need to change it to Japanese. Tell the kitchen staff that I need this protein to be made so that we can make something.
Yeah.
And they will then, in that language, go and create the protein
Yeah.
that you need. So
And the letters, and you can think about those letters as like the letters of the alphabet.
yeah.
So I mean, Japanese, but it will have to be the phonetic translation.
yeah, exactly.
not to the different characters, but then the language as an analogy for this is it's probably a good fundamental idea to start with, because you let's talk about language and food. You
Yeah.
had the great idea about how this might work. You know what I mean? So what's the analogy?
I was telling you earlier about languages and food, and well, I asked you if you knew the reason why, because in most languages, if you think about an animal that you are preparing to cook and then eat, it's usually the name for the animal and the meat is like the same thing. Like chicken is like the same thing. They don't have like a separate word for like poultry, like we do in like English.
Right,
So
like chicken versus poultry.
yeah, so like in English linguistics, like what I learned from what the hypothesis or theories are, is that during like olden like aristocratic times, like the people in the front of the house, usually like I think speaking like romantic languages, maybe like Roman or French or Italian or something like that. And people in the back of the house, through the servants, they were speaking like Germanic type of languages. So the people at the front of the house would be like, I want to eat cow today. And then maybe they tell their butler, who knows both languages, and then the butler goes to like the kitchen staff and they're like, oh, the master or the boss wants to eat beef, right? Same thing, but two different words. So like if you think about it in terms of coding or like DNA, the DNA is like front of the house is like, oh, I want this sort of thing. And the back of the house, the ribosome and the proteins, it's like a different language. End of the day, you get the same thing, but it's these different languages that are being translated. So it's being transcribed by the butler and then translated later on into the protein. So that's
so that then the enzymes and the cooks, they're busy making this delicious food,
exactly.
And then you have delicious food like corn. Sorry, we've been having this, it's exploded, this idea of the kid
explaining corn,
who loves corn.
He likes corn.
Yeah.
You can't imagine a more
juice,
beautiful thing. Yeah, it's got the juice.
Yeah, absolutely.
DNA
and I mean, DNA makes all of this possible.
Exactly.
DNA is the juice.
Yeah. So it's definitely one of those things where it's like it's all the same aim, just different languages using different molecules in order to accomplish the end goals. And then you came back to me with, okay, so if you can go like more modern, like if you're in a restaurant and you see something like on a menu and it's got like a weird name, like filet mignon, that's different. It's a different language from what we speak. But then when you go to like, when the waiter or the waitress takes it to the back, they say, oh, like fire up another steak or whatever, and then they prepare it in that way, and then they come back with a filet mignon, which is just a cut of beef at the end of the day. But at the end of the day, like your message came through, and with different languages and different meanings, you managed to get the same thing accomplished. This whole like process that we're talking about in biology is called the central dogma of biology, and it's kind of like the most fundamental way of how life like operates on a cellular level, which is the most basic way of how biology goes down, including marine biology, which is part of it.
And so if the DNA is sitting in cells and it's kind of like it's copied and it's sitting by there's two. That's why it has a double helix. They could say a double helix because you said you get the one side of the base pair as the code, and you get a reciprocal side, on the other side, and they kind of like come together, and then they have to wind up, and then that's where you get chromosomes and things like that. The structure that sit in the nucleus of a cell. And eventually, if you need something, if you need some information, the chromosomes have to unwind, and that specific spot needs to be exposed, and then you need to get that code to be exposed to certain enzymes, and then they have to produce just the piece that is relevant, and that piece then can go out of the nucleus into the ribosomes, where they might be manufacturing, the proteins that they need, and then the process carries on, isn't it?
Yeah. Sure.
And if the whole cell needs to then be replicated, if there's like something called mitosis, where the cell has to split and make a copy of itself, isn't it?
Yeah.
Then you can imagine all this information of the DNA unraveling, and then being copied, so that now at some point there's like double the amount of information,
Yeah.
and then at a certain point that information is that split, and then two nuclei appear, and then eventually like you get two cells, and that's mitosis, isn't it? That's very neat stuff in biology, isn't it?
Copying it a paste from one side to the other to get a new one. And that process is called mitosis, which is a straight kind of copy. But sometimes this copying can be mistakes, right, Nelson? Like sometimes it doesn't always go according to plan. You don't get the same thing, the same person that gets copied, and we call that kind of like, okay, in coding, those are like errors. That might be why your code doesn't run. In biology we call that mutation. So it's subtle changes in that code of life that results in things being different. So we call that an expression. So like what you see like on the outside of the organism, like on a larger level, is what's being expressed by the code that's on the cellular level. And things can be expressed in different ways depending on how the code looks, how the genes are. And if you change the genes, the coding, then things are expressed differently. Like people have different colored eyes because their coding is different.
There's also in terms of expression, it's actually you have mutations that that can lead to different expressions of like the information in that gene. But there's also even processes in between, because there's this whole process of taking the message and then having to move it along, and during that process there could also be an alternative expression. So it can get a little bit complicated, isn't it?
Yeah, 100%. I like to think of it like back to our like restaurant analogy, like champagne. Like it's not called champagne if it's not like from the Champagne region of France. It's coding.
Right.
It's coding for a different thing. It's a different like expression, even though it might be very similar. I mean, it's wine.
Yeah,
it's just
and it might be what is needed in the environment.
Exactly.
Maybe there's a celebration and champagne is called for, but they don't have champagne exactly. But that's what the environment. So the environment can actually influence the expression of certain genes,
exactly.
and the outcome may you may have an organism that is just better suited for the environment or not. There's also mutations that lead to problems with the function of life.
Maybe things that just
diseases as well.
Exactly. Yeah. So things can be like pathological or not good. Some things can be good, in which case like survival, the whole survival of the fittest thing comes into play, and evolution. And some things are just like really don't do anything, and then they kind of get passed on until one day it might code for something, or it just kind of it's like part of it is called genetic drift. Like you're just drifting away, but there's no real like coding or nothing good or bad. It's just different over time.
And there's many different kinds of mutations and reasons for mutations. That could be environmental. The causes can be related to environmental.
Are you telling me
changes.
Spider-Man is real now? Is that what you're telling me right
I'm
now?
telling you, Spider-Man is real. I mean, come on, you gotta believe. You gotta believe.
100%.
But and because and now that you speak about that, with great power comes great responsibility,
Yeah,
isn't it?
yeah.
And we do have the power now. Since the Genome Project, the Human Genome Project, and this is what really sparked all of this. We have a lot of power. The Human Genome Project, it basically mapped the all of the DNA and in the whole all of the genes, the entire gene set for a human being. That's called the genome, right?
Yeah.
And by doing that, it gives us a lot of information about. That can be useful, a lot of information about genes that we have that can be useful for medicine and specifically for genetically transmitted sort of diseases, right? So that was a big, it was a big investment, but definitely something was very positive. But again, it also led to things like forensics, as you mentioned earlier, developing. And it also led towards, manipulations, the ability to genetically modify organisms. So imagine now you have a way to cut away certain parts of the DNA and insert other parts in that place, and then allow the cell to continue its function. And so it's a lot of power. It's a lot of power. So there's a lot of responsibility as well.
Some people will argue you're playing God there because you're actually changing things. And this has been a great advancement for humanity, especially when it comes to food production, agriculture. Some things just cannot grow where you are unless they've been modified in some way.
Yeah.
The corn is a big example of that. Golden corn?
Yeah, corn. Is it corn. Because there's different ways to manipulate which genes are expressed and which genes are, passed on, and, there's different ways of manipulating it. And the classic way is to just, only allow certain organisms to breed, which is why today we have corn. Whereas in the past, it was so small, I think every time we say that, we should have the kids say it. Okay. Future editing, Janos, got that in there. 100%. Editing.
I think my last language analogy will be that languages also mutate and change in the same way. Our current version of English did not exist in this way hundreds and thousands of years ago. If you think of something like Shakespeare, they were talking some other language, it seems even though it was English. And even now, every year, the Oxford Dictionary, which is kind of the standard of English, that is being updated to add new words. And do you want to hear some of the words, Nelson, that were added last year?
I do. I need to keep up.
Yeah, you need to keep up. One of them is flex. Can you tell me what flex means? Not in the same context as it usually existed.
No, but that's we even use that all the time. Yeah, hey bro, you flexing, eh? You're showing off,
exactly,
isn't it?
Yeah.
Or stop flexing,
flexing on people, exactly. Yeah. What about yeet? You know yeet?
Yeet. I do not. Yeah. I did not use that.
Yeet is a very.
How would you use it in a sentence?
I yeeted my pillow out of the window. I yeeted the shoe out the door.
Okay, yeah, that's I don't know.
I yeeted the corn into my mouth. Yeah, it's basically toss or throw. Yeet.
It must be done in a very specific way, perhaps.
Yeah. It's very meme-ish type of way.
I see.
Dad joke as an expression was only
finally.
Yeah, it was officially.
My petition to
was it you?
Many years. No, I'm kidding. I'm making a dad joke. There you go.
Exactly. Well done. So that is an official term. Has been officially added. The next one is not as funny, but I thought it was interesting because, like, you didn't know this, but the term "ghost kitchen" was
No.
added.
Yeah, I mean, I heard other terms, Hell's Kitchen, things like that,
Yeah.
but Ghost Kitchen, no.
Ghost kitchen was added, and that's a term for restaurants that don't like have a place where you can sit down. They just have a kitchen that they make food in, and they use delivery apps like Uber Eats or like Mr. Delivery to like deliver the food. But if you want to go to that store, like you'd go there, and it's probably just like a parking garage or just like it's
Yeah.
like there's no actual restaurant. So I thought that was interesting because
Yeah, interesting.
that is an evolution because of technology, because like that those apps and those services exist now. This term for a kitchen
Yeah.
did not exist. So that's the kind of
Yeah.
mutation that happens to language because things are changing because of technology. Because
In the environment,
exactly,
for sure.
which
Yeah.
is very similar to how genes kind of change for animals and things. Species evolve over time with changes in the environment.
Yeah. And I mean, the ghost kitchen became very popular because, we all went through a pandemic, and
Exactly.
now everyone
Yeah.
would have, a lot of people would have come into
Yeah. People.
contact with this term, or
Yeah.
having to use ghost kitchens if they, if they,
Because
they're-
you
they're
couldn't
able to.
at the start of the pandemic, couldn't leave your house. You couldn't go sit at a restaurant. That means restaurants were losing business because they didn't have sitting customers. But they still had rent to pay on those places. So then they were like, "Okay, maybe I should either sell end my lease."
So they evolved.
Yeah, they evolved. Get a smaller place, get a ghost kitchen, and now deliver.
Yeah.
So I think we've pretty much covered everything about DNA and the basics. So let's get into what that means for our marine science or future marine science students and people. Like, where can we apply like this knowledge now for marine science?
Well, there's a it is a tool. DNA based tools and genetics are now widely accepted and very useful tools, and widely used as well, because the technology is making it cheaper for us to use it, cheaper and cheaper. And there is different different cool technological approaches that allow us to gather a lot of information about the environment and to confirm, for example, what life there is out there. Since we know something about the fundamental codes, then if the codes exist, then life is probably not far behind. And we spoke already about large projects that are going on in South Africa. Check our other
Link in the description.
It's going to be somewhere.
Or in the cards.
But certainly it's becoming a very common part of every scientific project that involves life and involves an organism. Even the biodiversity, the definitions, and what tools do you use to ensure that we have a grasp on what kind of diversity we're dealing with. And that diversity is made up of species. So we may be talking about, what is a species as well. And species is a taxonomical term, so it's naming conventions, like what we call something. Again, it comes down to like we need to agree on what to call something for some reason, practical or otherwise. And it's applicable to everything that's going on around us, to food, to forensics, to problem solving, and it underpins all of the studies. Like, we are both ecophysiologists, as we found out in that other
episode, exactly.
And imagine we didn't know. Like, how can we make sure that we're dealing with the same species? And, we have to look at genetic analysis and DNA.
DNA for me in ecophysiology, like I used it for my master's project, looking at, because remember we talked about like climate change and what happens with free radicals is that it can damage your DNA. And the way we tested that out is like isolating the DNA and looking like how broken the DNA is. And we use something called a comet assay, because like if you have a normal like functioning like nucleus, it would just be like a circle, right? Because everything's like intact. But if your DNA is being like broken down by these free radicals or oxidants, then it kind of breaks and it forms this like comet in the gel that you use electrode free. So we use
Right. Yeah. But everything is just broken and
yeah,
like disorganized, and then that gives you a pretty good indication that something is wrong.
something's wrong. So
Yeah, and then for me, with alien invasive species, there's such things as cryptic species. Because it's also arbitrary, and we'll talk about it when we talk about the species. But there's also there's a genetic let's call it a genetic pool, and so if a species is like this pool, and that's relevant because we're talking about water and marine science, and it's all about water. So imagine a big pool. And by the way, the ocean is the biggest gene pool, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's a lot of DNA. If you want to extract DNA, just go to the ocean.
Yeah.
That's where you're going to find a lot of different kind of DNA. But now imagine that, like, you can't. Where do you say that one organism's, pool is different from another group of organisms' pool? Like, is there an overlap? And is there is there a gap? And what's the degree of the gap before you say, okay, the mutations are so many that things are now different, and what percentage of difference is that gap? And so we use DNA as a tool to get a sense for that, and then to come up with and to try disentangle sometimes some of the taxonomic entanglements, because there's many different names that have been given based on only what the species looks like, and to add DNA to the study of what things look like, it helps to maybe make sense of what's going on.
Like previously, like all we had to go on were, because we could only see at a certain like magnification, which was our eyes, like was how things look. And over time we realized that even though something might look like another thing, on a genetic level they're very different. So we
and I mean, take it as food. Sometimes foods look the same, and when you taste it, they taste completely different, and you know they're different.
100%. It's the same. The champagne and the
it's different.
The fuzzy wine again.
Or perhaps the different kinds of corn.
Yeah, exactly.
And if you add the butter,
it changes everything. Yeah, 100%.
It changes everything.
And just to point out, so that's like from we spoke about like the ecophysiology. That's like from a population genetics / taxonomy level. I just want to point out, like, we did record a WWF SASSY eco label podcast, and we did mention there that forensics comes in, because sometimes people are dishonest with the types of meat and or fish that they put in the market. So there is a branch of people that go about testing products to ensure that whatever is on the label, like whatever fish, is the right fish and it's not like just something else. Especially because we want those green...
Or it could be a mistake.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean? It could be dishonesty, it could be a mistake, but it will help us solve the mystery of what's going on, because sometimes it is confusing. And then the other thing is that you can even do it yourself. Things are now possible, like in a school, you could work with scientists, and we could do a barcode of life project, and it has been done for that purpose. School students have gone out, collected samples from the supermarket, and then they just confirmed whether or not those fish, for example, were the species that they were displayed. Exactly. And you can do that through DNA and barcode of life analysis.
Yeah, 100%. Can you think of any other ways we can apply DNA knowledge? I'm sure.
There's so many.
I'm sure there's so many,
and I'm sure someone can come up with them even in the comments, and someone can share their experiences, and we'll just keep on working on this tool, because this tool is just getting more exciting. There's next generation sequencing as well, which enables us to from one sample of water. So if you take, we said in the ocean there's so much water, it's so much DNA, right? So now imagine you take a sample of water from different depths, and you can actually run it and look for different genes, and all at the same time, or find do an analysis of the different types of life, or the fragments of life that you find in that water sample, all at once.
That's pretty cool.
And
that's like some Star Trek stuff.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
That's some Star Trek stuff, absolutely. And it's things like environmental DNA. So eDNA, right, is a next gen approach to to DNA sequencing and to DNA.
100%. I'm sure that there's many, many more. You can tell us all about it in the comment section, or you can like the video, subscribe to the channel on podcast services, do us a rate. Or you can tell us on social media at Agulhas Current on Twitter, Agulhas Current Affairs on other platforms. You can tell me personally at Geekoscopy, most of the internet. What about you, Nelson?
Yeah, and you can find me on the internet as well. Just look for Argonaut Science or Nelsonpod. I think I'm at Nelsonpod in most things. We're not very difficult to find. You look for us.
That pretty much spells DNA now.
That spells DNA.
Yep. Thank you. Thank you for listening, and cheers.